all of a sudden, okay, the child is with both biological parents. Presumably, that biological father, who's now the new husband, is supporting the child. So why is this third person then still being held legally accountable? But you're right. I would agree. If the biological father abandoned completely, then clearly it's in the child's best interest to have some sort of um, financial contribution from someone, regardless of what the biological father. I think it's complicated, but I appreciate the best interest thinking.
I guess I just think that the reasoning that laws are the way they are because of evolution and evolutionary thought that's influenced us over millennia, basically, it's just faulty on its face. And I suppose I'd have to read the article to understand what he's saying. But it's sort of like a false justification, or I guess inductive reasoning as opposed to deductive reasoning, to say that laws are the way they are because there's an evolutionary explanation. Because if you think about, a lot of laws are counterintuitive from an evolutionary perspective. If the goal of the gene is to reproduce themselves at all costs to the expense of others, then a lot of our laws, which basically perpetuate a society that works together peacefully, would counter that example. It would make sense to be able to eliminate those from society who are not healthy reproducers, or to kill off the competition, for example, or to not value monogamy in a lot of respects, because if the idea is to spread your gene as much as possible, then why would we have laws prohibiting things like adultery? And also, it seems like it's dangerous to get in the hands of people who would say that evolution is a justification for the way laws are. Then you'll have people saying, this law is the way it is because we can't help ourselves. It's the way we are forced to do legally. We can't have laws validating gay marriage because evolutionarily it doesn't make sense. Or we can't have laws that allow people to get divorced because evolutionarily it doesn't make sense. Things like that. I guess that's
to respond to the idea that there would be no sort of cooperative law that would evolve from an evolutionary perspective, I don't think that necessarily follows. I think
that's true.
I mean, you can imagine lots of ways in which natural selection would tend to prefer members of the species that participated to some degree cooperatively. Obviously, there's going to be like a certain amount of selfishness. Maybe that's not obvious, but probably a certain amount of selfishness does get rewarded. But you can, develop societies in which survival is maybe amplified and more successful if you've got members of the species working together. I mean, I think that's sort of, how socialized creatures sort of gradually develop over time. Sort of, they recognize that teamwork is going to be better for the group than sort of, every creature for itself kind of philosophy. So I do think that cooperative laws can be explained by evolutionary processes. And that, it sounds like the other objection is actually sort of that naturalistic fallacy idea that the idea that this is evolutionary means that it's necessarily good and that we should reinforce it simply for that reason. I think that's what the gay marriage argument would be susceptible to, is to say that's a naturalistic fallacy, that because this isn't evolutionary, it's not desirable. So, I mean, I think that both of those objections can sort of be accommodated by this explanation, potentially. But I don't know. I haven't actually read the article or anything, so I don't know if maybe other people have thoughts about that.
I think my biggest issue with it is that it just gives evolution too much credit. I mean, first of all, or at least the way that you spoke about it, and this is a big issue, and I think the evolution research is that people personify evolution. Man evolved, as if he controlled it, or as if it actually sometimes shoots the evolutionary arguments in the foot, because it sounds as if there's an underlying, divine entity that's controlling this or something, which science, at least if you want to purely look at it from a science perspective, it just kind of is more like random mutations. So it's too much personification, giving too much credit to evolution as if there's a controlling force there that's causing it, whereas in fact it's these small genetic mutations and there's no central command center. So I didn't like that perspective of it, and I think that can also, from looking at it from a legal argument, from what you said, gay marriage we're against, but we permit, or we're saying that we can't allow gay marriage because it's anti-evolutionary from that argument, but yet we prevent polygamy, which is very pro-evolutionary from a perspective of spreading your seed. So, because you can produce a lot more children that way.
Well, I mean, I heard this, I listen to this show Radio Lab sometimes. Does anybody know this show? It's a very interesting sort of popular science show. There was a story about this, I think he was a Russian guy who decided to breed foxes to be more domesticated or whatever, you know? So he would, anytime a fox showed fear, like the baby fox showed fear when he came near the cage, he would either shoot that fox or in some other way just, you know, eliminate it from the reproductive capacities. And the foxes that were nice when you came to the cage, those would get to reproduce. And this sort of very quickly, over like 10 generations or so, he had these foxes, their ears had sort of flopped over and their bones were not quite as firm because they, I guess, didn't get as much adrenaline, which was the big thing that was sort of making foxes afraid in the first place. That's like a vision of evolution as sort of purposeful, right? It's sort of like, okay, I'm going to get this end goal. And so it doesn't necessarily apply, although weirdly, I mean, the people in the show sort of did this thing where they hypothesized that a lot of the changes that have taken place to humans sort of weirdly parallel the way these foxes have evolved, because of sort of the idea is that we need to be able to get along with each other to be able to do the things that we're successful at as a species, right? So we sort of, in our own spontaneous way, do select out for those sort of aggressive behaviors in a way that's not necessarily purposeful, like there's not a guy with a gun there waiting, but there is some kind of, you know, agreement that gets forged kind of spontaneously, intuitively, or whatever, that has the appearance of being purposeful simply because it's responsive to its environment. But that's, you know, that's sort of a kind of purposefulness that's implicit rather than planned out, right? You don't need to sort of coordinate that and say, okay, there's going to be a point to this. It just sort of, you know, happens that way. I don't know if that's actually, at this point, I don't know if anything is that responsive to your comment at all.
I guess sort of the argument that prison, I mean, as a punishment, hasn't been around that long. I mean, it's only the latter half of the 18th century where, like, serious prisons where you went away for any sort of time. And prior to that, there were jails where women and men were mixed together, basically. So I feel from an evolutionary standpoint, I don't understand that argument. They would do corporal punishment, or they would just give people the death penalty, or they would, you know, send them off into another colony. I guess. I mean, I don't see how that would decrease their chances of reproducing necessarily if it's just corporal punishment.
And prisons permit conjugal visits. So have your spouse come and knock her out. Yeah.
Or like the guard can, you know, like attack the woman in prison, that sort of thing.
Just, I mean, real quick, I mean, it's true. I mean, it might not be like all or nothing, like definitely no reproductive chance, but I think most people would agree that being in prison is highly restrictive on your chances to be reproductively successful. So, you know, you can always have your spouse come, you know, and you can have it. I mean, you can, you know, make a baby while you're in prison during a conjugal visit. You know, it's not like the state will then abort any sort of kid because it happened during a conjugal visit. But the chances of, you know, you going out there, meeting other people, being able to choose someone other than a spouse who's willing to have a conjugal visit with you in jail, are obviously very low. So I think that, you know, it doesn't need to be all or nothing to also show that imprisonment is a way to reduce reproductive
I'd like to see the data on that, of how people in prison have lower reproductive results.
No, that's absolutely true. I don't have any.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't get into the end notes of this article, but there were several hundred of them. So, yeah, I mean, these are definitely things worth investigating. And I think as far as, I mean, the modern evolution of you know, segregated prisons and whatnot, I mean, I think it's always a concern with evolutionary biology and psychology not to kind of when you're wielding that evolutionary hammer, not to look at everything as evolutionary nails. But it seems like, you know, corporal punishment, getting your hand chopped off, getting the living hell